Okay, great. We're live. I can get rid of this thing in 1 second. Cool. Sorry, that was a little bit of a weird ritual that I want to kind of stop. We're not very technically professional, as you may notice. Okay, great. We're live. I can get rid of this thing. Thanks so much for talking with us. Like, on such a it's really cool. It is like the second of these interviews, and really, we want to make something just informal to talk about what you've been doing, the work that you do, your kind of a story into like doing art, making art.
Mm-hmm.
And so thanks so much for doing that.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me. I mean, it's always like fun to talk about work. Not so much like my work usually, but like I guess that's what we're going to do today. But just painting in general.
Yeah, so maybe to start off, I think it would be great to get a sense of, a little bit of your education, or sort of how you came to be an artist, some of maybe like the formative experiences that sort of led you on the path that you're on.
Sure. So like, I guess if you go back, there's like a couple funny stories. Like one, I have this story of when I was in kindergarten, and some kid was like drawing like a little race car or something, and I was like, I can draw a race car like that, and he was like, no, you can't. And then I was that's kind of what started me like drawing. I don't even know why. It was just to like prove this kid wrong. But then essentially like that ended up turning into cartooning. Basically did cartooning and comic books through high school. And it wasn't until I got to undergrad at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque that I was first exposed to oil painting. And even then I was thinking like, I'm gonna focus on art, but I think in the back of my head I was still thinking like illustration or comic books or something like that. And then once I got introduced to painting there, that was kind of it. I was just like so enthralled by the medium, and then just like learning as much as I could about the history of painting specifically. I mean, that gradually turned into a broader history of art in general, but like initially was very painting focused. And I really didn't know that much at the time. Like I had studied some artists in high school, because I was in this thing called academic decathlon, and there was one of the categories was like artists, and we had to like,
yeah.
Did you, Patrick, did you do academic decathlon?
No, I did debate though, so I'm sort of familiar with the
right. It's like the same world. Yeah. So yeah, I had like a little bit of a background there. I was really into I remember actually for it wasn't for AD, is actually for this other nerdy thing I did in high school called the Odyssey of Mind, and we won nationals. And we went to DC, and that was probably the first time I ever went to DC. But we went to the National Gallery, and there was a Picasso early work exhibit that I got to see, like a retrospective of like his early work, basically going right up until his Rose period. And it was like it really blew my mind. That was like right before going to college, and just seeing all of his work at the time. I think it had like probably more of like a sort of subconscious like effect on me than I really realized. But then like when I got into undergrad, I really started focusing on painting and just learning everything about it. I was very was very open to just trying all kinds of stuff. And that was really the entire spectrum of types of painting, whether it was like a very academic kind of realism to, you know, very like abstract paintings. I just kind of looked at undergrad as just like, I just want to learn as much about this as I can. And I'm not really tied to a particular style or a particular thing. And it's just like, as I learned more about painters, you know, it's like I would go to the, this is in the late 90s. So it's like the internet is still in its infancy, basically. So I had to go to the art library that they had at the university, and I would just go through the books there. And that was like, I spent so much time in that library, fine arts library there. And, you know, just looking through artists that most people are just common, you know, like the first time I really got into Abex painters like de Kooning or Rothko, and then just being fascinated by those paintings and trying to figure out how they made them, and really trying to like do that in the studio, like really trying to like figure out like how do you manipulate the material in this way. And it's like every month or so, like I would discover like a new person home, like, oh, Richard Diebenkorn, what is this guy? You know, like Wayne Thiebaud, who is this guy? And it was just like, just through the library, just through these books, and sort of building up a vocabulary of seeing like images of paintings, and then like making the association of like, how do you make that type of painting? You know, being able to tell in a photograph if something is like thickly painted, or, you know, oh, that's clearly like absorbed into the canvas, or that, you know, just different technical ways of like applying material, and trying to like figure that out. So that was like undergrad was just that. It was like a lot of just, it was really fun at the time because it was just, there wasn't a lot of pressure. I think because I was a little unfocused, like I probably like didn't, I wasn't like a spectacular student for any of the professors. I don't think, like I wasn't anybody's like favorite student or anything. There's like, this guy, he's going to keep painting forever. You know, I think they all thought it was kind of funny because most of the other students, even at that age, they were very like kind of focused, or they kind of, which is kind of silly now when I look back. It's like nobody should be that focused when they're in their early 20s. So like thinking like, I know what I'm going to do. But yeah, by the end of undergrad, I figured I wanted to go to graduate school. I took like a year off after I graduated, and focused a little bit more on these kind of like photorealist paintings that were very Gerhard Richter inspired. He was another one that was like the first time I saw Richter, again in magazines and in books, but I was like, whoa, you can do this. Like that was really amazing. I was really interested in like, wait, he used a projector to make these, and like he's blurring it like the photograph, and he can seemingly kind of use whatever imagery he wants, because like the style sort of like unifies everything in an interesting way. So anyway, he was a very big influence at that time. So I kind of focused on making these very Richter-y inspired paintings, and that's what I applied to graduate school with, and got into the University of Pennsylvania, and went there for 2 years. And that was a huge, that was a major experience in my life, because that was the first time I was away from New Mexico, and just like alone, not knowing anybody, like I'd never done that before. And then it was just, I met all of these amazing artists that I'm still friends with to this day. And I had, really incredible teachers there. And then because it was like a really nice school, we had really great like visiting artists and critics and stuff. And I had never been really exposed to that prior. Also finally being in like a real big city, the Philadelphia Museum right there and the Rodin Museum, and then being within like train distance to New York. I think that was like one of the first things I did when I was there is I just like the first time I had a weekend, I got on a train and I went to New York and then just like walked around the Met for the whole day or whatever, just alone. Or it wasn't even the train. I think it was the China bus that I took. Just like got off in Chinatown, went up to the Met and then just wandered around. I was just like, it was amazing. So yeah, I met my wife there.
At the Met?
At the Met. No, at Penn. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. I could keep like rambling about my life. I don't know if you guys have specific questions, just stop me.
I was kind of curious. You mentioned what is like I had like two kind of questions that came out. What is like the kind of art that you can see when you're growing up in New Mexico?
Oh, right.
So I had like a similar, I don't know. I was like thinking about my experience going to Chicago when I was like 19.
Yeah.
And in Ecuador, where I'm from, you don't see anything. Like there's just not like major museum or, there used not to be, I think now there's more like contemporary art, but wasn't really big before. Yeah. And so like going to their institute was like, it's just like blows your mind because it's like all these works that you may have heard about or looking books, now they're all like there. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know, I had that question about what was the experience of art you had when you were in New Mexico? But also it seems like the school was very unique, like focus on painting, like I don't know, it seems very different from what like something like the schools now are, in which you can take all sorts of different things, which is good. I just wonder, yeah.
I mean, it definitely like, maybe I just like emphasize the painting too much because that's all I really cared about. But I had to take all kinds of different classes. I mean, it was, I got a BFA, but yeah, you had to take like, I took philosophy classes and, just science classes, like all kinds of normal curriculum, type stuff. And, but yeah, growing up there, you're exposed to a lot of like, obviously traditional like New Mexico folk art, which is like either Spanish colonial folk art or Native American art. And those both have like, those are like things at the time, like they've had a bigger impact on me than I probably just thought at the time that they would, Another big thing was like, I mean, New Mexico is small and kind of remote, like relatively remote, I guess. But, the university had its own like little sort of gallery and they'd have like decent shows there. And then there's the Albuquerque Museum and they would get, they have like a decent collection of like Southwestern art, which again, at the time I was very like antagonistic towards. But as I've gotten older, I like appreciate that stuff like a lot more. Georgia O'Keeffe was like a big influence, and she was kind of everywhere. In Santa Fe has like a O'Keeffe museum that we would go to, and she's another one that like, I think just like growing up, just looking at her paintings all the time because I'm from New Mexico. I was like not so much of a fan, and as I've gotten older, she's like one of my favorite painters now. She's such an amazing painter. I just like love her surfaces like so much and just her imagery. So I mean that's like what was there, sort of fine art wise. But I think a lot of that stuff really didn't mean anything to me until I got to college. Before college, it was really just focusing on like comic books and cartoons and, So, like all of the artists that I knew at the time and really revered were all comic book based, like Jack Kirby, Neil Adams, and all of these famous comic artists, and then a lot of like 90s comic book artists too. And that was really like where most of my energy went until I was in college. But I remember like, once I really started getting into painting, I did start going more to whatever I could see, like locally, that was painting, whether it was like at the Art Museum in Albuquerque or going to Santa Fe. And later, probably closer to like my junior or senior years in college, in undergrad, I started making trips to go. That was the first time I ever went to New York. I went out to New York just to go to the Met, essentially. And and the other, the other museums, but essentially like that was like, I'm going to go to New York just to see art, essentially. And did that. And that was like mind blowing. That was like, oh my God, the Met in particular. Yeah, it was just like, yeah, you're just seeing all of these things in person that you've seen in reproduction, and being able to just get right up to them. And so so I did that when there was the Richter retrospective around, I think it was around 2000 or so. It was originally in New York, but then it traveled to San Francisco, and I flew out to San Francisco just to see that show. And that was that again was just, that was the first full retrospective I'd ever seen. I mean, there was the Picasso one that I talked about in DC, but even that like stopped pretty early in his career, but seeing like the totality at the time, the totality of Richter's work was, that was just like, I mean, that like really reframed like what in my idea of what it meant to be like an artist, like a painter, because then you're really seeing like, oh, this is like decades of time, so yeah, I mean, it was like, I don't know, like it's kind of funny, I taught when I lived in New York. I taught in the Bronx for a couple of years, and I remember talking to my students there, and I would take them on like a field trip to the Met, and a bunch of them had never been to the Met. They like grew up in the Bronx and they'd never been to the Met, and so it's kind of like, even if you are in like a crazy place like New York or Chicago, sometimes depending on your background, like where you're from and what you kind of interested in, it's like, even then it's like sometimes people aren't exposed to anything, or don't get the opportunity to see anything, even if it's in your backyard,
Yeah. So maybe shifting conversation a little bit to talk about your work now. I guess I'm curious how you sort of started, working on the kind of work you've been doing recently, these square green landscapes, very sort of, there's definitely something about like repetition, memory going on. But yeah, I'm curious, what led you to making that kind of work?
I was living in New York after graduate school. I lived in New York for about 11 years. And I was painting. Post-grad school, my painting sort of evolved into, it really took me a long time to really fall into, I think this is what my work is going to be about. It's like there's so many possibilities of what you can be making as a painter, or the types of paintings you can be making, that it really is difficult to, if you're interested in a lot of things, a lot of different painters or styles or whatever, it really is difficult to kind of like focus in and be like, what am I really interested in? What do I really want to spend my time focusing on? And it really wasn't until I got to New York that really started settling my studio practice. And I was really trying to think like, what do I really care about? What do I really want to like look at and spend time in the studio doing for myself, you know? And in New York, it really became, I was like, oh, you know, I'm going to focus kind of on just the things that I'm encountering all the time. And that was sort of like an urban landscape. It was people that I knew. So I was painting a lot of like portrait paintings at the time, or figure paintings, and a lot of these like urban landscapes or sort of like cityscapes and stuff. And that's what I was doing most of the time I was in New York. And then I moved to Chicago about 6 years ago or so. And we moved when my wife and I moved in when we had our first daughter. And my wife was from Chicago, so that's where we came here. And I got a job teaching in north of Chicago in Lake Forest, and I would do this commute to work every day. And Chicago is like a surprisingly green place. I mean, it's a big city, but there's a lot of forest preserves around here. There's a lot of big parks, you know, because it's near the lake, and there's a lot of precipitation here. It's just very green. And I think, yeah, I'd been to Chicago many times, but I guess when I moved here, I thought it was going to be a little bit more like New York. Now we live in like the suburbs of Chicago, but really once I started living here, and especially once I started teaching north of here, it was just like my commute was mostly, I was on the highway and then I would get off and then it was just like green everywhere. Just like, that's what I was seeing like every day, like going to work, coming home, just, you know, trees and these really beautiful landscapes. And it was just sort of like, you know, I was just kind of absorbing it. And, you know, started painting at the time. Like I said, we had my daughter, she was a baby. You're just trying to, you know, we had just moved. And when you're in that sort of situation, you're just trying to like carve out some studio time to actually, you know, get some kind of work done. And a lot of my paintings, I was already working at a pretty modest scale in New York just because of like the size restrictions in New York, which I've always talked about as like, you know, a lot of artists want to work like very, very large. It's fine, but sometimes there are like actual limitations that you have just on like where you live, or, you know, the type of space you have or how much storage space you have. And those things can really impact your studio practice. It doesn't necessarily mean like that's good or bad, you know, it's sort of like how you use it. So when I came to Chicago, I was like, you know, my paintings got a little bit smaller because of the amount of space I had, the amount of time I had. And I really ended up liking those limitations, or at least it was interesting to me to work within those limitations. So the work started like sort of slowly evolving into being about these landscapes that I was seeing every day. And you know, I was thinking a lot about, because this is like another thing that I do constantly, is like when I'm like looking at things like landscape or cityscapes or people even, I might be thinking about how I'm feeling about those things. And then I also think about like artists that they remind me of. Like, you know, it's like I might see a landscape and think like, that reminds me of Wayne Thiebaud or something like that, you know? And then that can kind of like inform my approach to how I'm going to like paint that thing. So once I started like really saying, okay, I'm going to really just focus in on these like landscapes primarily, I started just saying like, you know what, I'm gonna stick to this relatively small size for a while. I'm gonna like limit my sort of color range for a little bit, and I'm gonna really paint how I've really wanted to paint for a long time, which is sort of like this a kind of more impasto-y or like painterly type of surface that I'd been wanting to do. And I think sometimes when you want to do something in painting, it can take a long time before you actually are able to do it. You know, like you might have the feeling a couple of years before you actually start doing something. So it might be like, I really have this feeling like I want to paint, you know, these blue paintings or whatever. And at least for me, it's not something that you can just like jump into. It has to be like sort of eased into. So it's almost like your intuition is telling you where you're going to go, but you can't just immediately go there. It has to be like a sort of slow transition to get there. And that's how I felt about how I was painting these landscapes. So, you know, once I really started focusing in on them and trying to see all the different permutations that are possible within those limitations that I had, it was a very interesting time to be painting for me. And that's kind of where I've been for like 5 years or so. The paintings have been getting a little bit bigger. I have a little bit more space now, and I feel a little bit more confident in my paint handling and my like ability to make these paintings. So I thought making them get a little bit bigger would be kind of interesting. Nothing like crazy, not like making like 8-foot paintings or anything, but you know, it's just like a little bit bigger than 12 inches or whatever. I don't know if that's exactly what you want to hear, but
That was pretty good. I mean, I had a question in terms of
sure.
now the way you approach the landscapes or these places that you're looking at, because of the, you know, they have like this sometimes strange, interesting forms of composing, like the floor would be like really large and then the trees would be on like the third or half of the composition, or something would be cut in the middle. It is this kind of, I don't know, that has a kind of vision as if, you know, things were like cropped and looked. And so I do wonder whether, you know, the way you approach painting these observations is something that you probably don't paint on the spot. I don't know, maybe you do, maybe you take a picture and go to the studio, maybe, I don't know, what is the kind of way that you approach it and how you think your relationship with those kind of images once you grab them to the studio?
Right. The process is kind of like all over the place. I don't really like have, which is kind of like, it's something that I wish I had more of, like just like a very specific way of finding sort of like whatever the raw material is of what I'm going to do in order to make a painting, but it's kind of all over the place. So like sometimes I will take a snapshot of something that I want to remember. I don't really paint from the photographic snapshot, but I might do a drawing from that. I might take that into Photoshop and like mess with it in Photoshop, and then maybe do a drawing or a small painting from that, and then turn that into like a larger painting. I also do iterations of things. So it's like if I have, my favorite thing actually is when I have a painting that I've done, that I've finished, and I see some kind of possibilities of another version of that painting that I could do. And I think the reason is, well, I mean, for one, like the main thing that I really get excited about is just like wanting to see, yeah, what if I do change this thing about this piece? Like, what is that going to look like, you know? And wanting to see those kind of possibilities. Once I have like a composition that I like, it's also much easier for me to improvise upon that initial composition and change things with like more. It's like it's almost like practicing a song on an instrument or something, and it's like once you have it memorized, it's like now you're able to improvise on the song. it's similar to that. So it's like the hardest part is figuring out like a totally original painting, you know, something that is not coming from something I've already done. And that can be the most difficult thing. And that can go through like multiple iterations until I get something that I like. And then once I have something that I like, if I think that there's like a possibility within that piece to do some other versions of it, I'm very excited about that. There's like a few motifs that I've been working on the past like year or so that like there's one of this sort of like hill form with like a lot of trees on top. So it's like a lot of sort of like negative space or just sort of like field in most of the composition that I've done like a few like iterations of. And I like when there's that possibility there and just sort of like pushing that as far as I can take it until there's nothing left to do there, you know. And I think that comes from like, you know, many of my favorite painters sort of work in a similar way to that, you know, like whether that's like de Kooning or Robert Ryman or, you know, people that have like you know, like these are my parameters. I'm going to push these as far as I can and until I get bored or can't do it anymore. And then I need to figure out some other new thing. So, you know, there's not really, again, I wish there was, I kind of envy like plein air painters because they can always just go out and like find like a new composition. You know, it's like, oh, what am I going to paint today? I'm just going to go outside and I'm going to paint whatever I see. You know, like Alex Katz does that. Lois Dodd does that. I mean, those are painters that I really love. And I totally get that. But I think there's something in me where I want, and maybe this goes back like a little bit to my like comic book and cartooning days, where I want to be inspired by something I'm seeing, but I'm going to change things anyway too, you know, because I want it to be like a good composition in the sense that I want it to be like exciting pictorially, you know. And sometimes it's very difficult to do that if you're just like looking at something and trying to like make something interesting out of it, and you're not willing to sort of change anything about it really. You know, so there's not really it becomes very it can get very frustrating because it's it's difficult to do. I wish I was more of like a Lois Dodd type of painter. I'm like too big of a baby to like go outside and like paint really.
You live in Chicago, it's colder.
Well, that's true too. Yeah, it's like right now, it's like it'd be like impossible for me to do. The summers are great though. For that.
Oh, the summers are beautiful in Chicago.
Yeah.
I know, Patrick, do you have a question?
You can go ahead.
Okay. I mean, once you mentioned Lois Dodd, and I was just thinking about her painting the other day. One thing that, you know, you do say, like when we were talking about the motifs, is like the things that you have around you, and so it becomes trees and sort of the urban landscape. But you have a specific way of framing it that I find very interesting. Like you do simplify it. You sometimes seem to focus on the things that seem more, I don't know how to put it, like the corner of things. I remember seeing one of I don't know if this is yours. I was like looking up online, Googling, and I found one that it was a painting of Brooklyn sort of building, like it was the corner of the building and then a big tree.
Yeah.
And like both of them were like, you know, it's not that you focus on the majestic, I don't know, sublime feeling of the building, or like you focus on an open landscape that you can see the depth of it and the mountains at the back, like a Rubens-like thing. You kind of push into to like smaller things that then you present with a kind of presence in the foreground.
Right.
That I do wonder, you know, where you come at it. Like, how did you come at that kind of idea, that kind of vision of the objects that you're paying attention to?
I think that's like that's really great that you picked up on that, because it's like, that's something I think about a lot, because I think it's the type of, I think there are painters that, and this may sound counterintuitive for like a landscape painter, but like space and forms within a painting, there's like different types of, I mean, this is my own like theory, but there's different types of painters of like where they want to, what type of space and what type of forms they want to give you. So, you know, you brought up like Rubens or maybe some more like expansive landscape type of painter, and they want to give you that sort of deep space where like the plane really goes back and you're just sort of encompassed by that, right? But then there's other painters who actually, like, most of the painters that I really respond to are like painters who like bring everything like close to you. And it's almost like sometimes I think like maybe this is like my background in like figurative painting, and you know, just having like a portrait, just like the thing that you're supposed to be focused on is just there, you know, like up close. And I think it's like a combination of that. Like Philip Guston is like a painter like that, and he's like a painter that I really admire. And Thibaut's like that for a lot of his work too, especially like his mountain paintings. It's just like this form, you know, that's just like taking up most of the plane. And I try to think about that too. And maybe that's like trying to like combine some of the more abstract elements that I really love in painting, and like some of the abstract painters that I really love. One of the things I always like really envy about abstract painters, at least certain types of abstract painters, is their ability to self-generate imagery and self-generate like paintings, you know. I think it's also like landscape painting can be, it's very easy for it to become kind of like boring looking, you know. It has like it can have that connotation very easily if you're not careful about what you're, because there's so much landscape historically, and you know, you see it like all the time, and a lot of the motifs or a lot of the compositions are very similar. So you know, you really have to try, you have to try pretty hard to like break out of that in order to get something that's a little more unique or more towards like what you actually find interesting. And I think for me, that kind of is what I'm looking at in the landscape. So I am looking for those spaces that are kind of like awkward, or it's like, how far can I push this where it's just mostly this kind of like negative space or the corner of this thing. And a lot of that is just like, can be very intuitive. And I tend to respond compositionally. I tend to respond to things in almost like a personality kind of way, to where I'll do different compositional things and how they make me feel. Like I might think like oh, like this building butting up against this tree is like they're like fighting each other, or I might think like they're like hugging each other, or you know, or like this particular landscape composition feels like happy to me, that these like this little cloud is like in this area or whatever. And I think, you know, I've made plenty of landscapes where if I'm trying to be too literal about what I'm painting, it's like I might make a painting and then I'm like, no, it's just too basic. It's just too boring. And then usually they just get sanded down. They just like get rid of them, you know. So it is like difficult. Again, that's why I'm so excited when I like find some sort of composition that I can play around with, because then I don't have to worry about that, about like, oh yeah, this is just going to look kind of like boring, because I've already figured out most of difficult parts. Yeah, I mean, sometimes too, though, I feel like maybe I can push that stuff too far too. Like I've had paintings where it's like there's barely anything going on, and like sometimes I'm like, I wonder what people think about this. Like, it's like just like a little bit of like shadowy shrubbery at the top of the painting or whatever.
Yeah, maybe to I mean, I had a very similar question actually to what Gabriel asked about, yeah, the relationship between, the foreground, middle ground, and background, and the way that, the way that you work with the horizon line, it is always sort of pushing everything forward and almost sort of denying like a perspective or like a view.
Right.
So you're not really like looking out into something, but it's sort of like, the painting itself is pushing forward. And I get the sense that what it does is it emphasizes like the handling of the paint, or like the painting of the painting. And then that to me also sort of is then related to like your sort of understanding or your absorption of like the history of art and the history of painting. So I guess to maybe put it to you as like, where do you see yourself within the history of landscape painting, or maybe not, or like what do you see as like the condition of that kind of painting today, or like where how do you see your work fitting in to that trajectory?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It seems like there's a lot of landscape painting going on. Now granted, that could be like, I never know with this stuff with like social media, like Instagram and stuff, because it's like, like the algorithm just sort of reads what you're interested in and it just shows you more of that. So sometimes it's like, is this really going on, or am I just like imagining this, so I think that there's, I'm very glad that it's being taken like a little bit more serious lately, and I think a big part of that is because there's a lot of painters now that are just making like really good landscape painting that isn't just like exclusively just like pretty or easy or kind of like boring or whatever. So I think that that's like a big part of like what's kind of going on right now. As far as like me, like where I kind of fit. I mean, I've always felt a little out of time a little bit, just because the different things that I'm trying to like bring together from like the painters that I really love and all of the stuff that I've studied my whole life. Sometimes I feel like, it's kind of in the middle sometimes, so that, it's like I am trying to synthesize somebody like Ryman with somebody like Manet or something like that, and it's like sort of figuring out like, how do I bring these influences that I really love together? And there's obviously always in any given moment, there's always going to be like certain trends and stuff that are going on stylistically, like what type of like space or like what types of like sort of distortions are kind of popular for painters to be using, and I don't know how much I like fit in with any of that sometimes, but I always just want people to like look at my paintings and really give them like some time, a little bit of time, and to really look at them and like take them on their own merits. And I do feel a lot of the time with a lot of time when people are just like looking at work, whether it's online or in galleries or whatever, sometimes people just use a shorthand of like what is, like they're looking for those signifiers of, okay, landscape painting might be having like a moment right now, but what are like the popular signifiers of like, of good landscape painting right now? And if they don't see that immediately in a gallery, they're just like dismiss things. And like I get this a lot with my paintings, like people will say, you know, I saw your paintings and then I went up, and it wasn't until I like went up close to them and like really looked at them for a little while where I realized sort of what you were doing and how like sort of whatever, how like luscious the surface is, or, you know, and I think sometimes, again, that's just people using that shorthand of like, they just see like green landscape or whatever, and they can be dismissive of it, you know, especially if it's in like a loud environment with a lot of other crazy stuff going on. But you know, my work sort of fits more in this. It's a little bit more quiet, a little bit more contemplative, and has to be like sort of experienced by itself, like preferably with like a few of the paintings like around. So, but yeah, I mean, you know, just being in this, this is like true for a lot of the people that I like, you know, like the people like Thibaut or Albert York or Maureen Galais, or I mean, these are like all painters that kind of like fit into this same place where you kind of have to give it a little bit of time, you know, for it to sort of like, for you to actually like see it. Which is like, and that's like both like maybe like a problem now because everybody wants things kind of like immediately visually now. So it can be a problem, and then at the same time, it's like if people actually do give it a little bit of time, it can be very rewarding. So then I hear that a lot from people where they're like, "Oh yeah, this was like a very nice, unique experience that I had with your painting, but I had to give it like a bit of time, you know." I don't know if that's like a good answer or not.
Yeah.
You know, Alex Katz has like I haven't seen the show yet at the Guggenheim, but you know, I don't know if I'll be able to make it out to go see that show, but you know, he has such a big part of his work is like landscape painting, and sometimes I really love his paintings, but I particularly love his the little paintings. So the small paintings that he bases the big paintings on. And you know, sometimes I think about you know, fitting in that kind of like painterly realm of he's another good painter who's like sort of like he's on that like edge of like, is this abstraction, is it representation, you know, focusing in on things that you maybe wouldn't focus on, like very like, you know, oh, here's just like a few trees and some leaves or something, not like a typical kind of like space, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I guess something of what you were saying, that it does really, you know, what is the ultimate goal for looking at a painting? It's what makes me think. It is like that moment when you like go over the fact of how you normally look at everyday life, at pictures, or just as you walk around the world, and you like you're just giving a second look and start paying attention. And especially in your paintings, it's like you start seeing the brush marks that like move to somewhere, there's like a movement implied, or there is like I mean, something that I was looking at just from pictures, because unfortunately haven't been able to see them in person, is the colors become super important. Whether you use you know, a clear color against the green, and then there's a darker color underneath. And as I was going along your paintings from 2000, I think in your website is 2021 to 2022.
Mhm.
There is just more, it becomes a bit more complex in terms of there start being more divisions.
Mhm.
And now instead of being like one tree, the sky and the floor, now you had the tree, the space above, the space below the tree, and then the floor. And like the way that you start choosing what a specific color and how it relates to another, like seems extremely, intentional. Like it seems to have a very like an intention that it remains somewhat enigmatic to me, but I don't feel it is just kind of a straightforward pick, like a straightforward choice. And I don't know. It does make me think about what we expect from painting, what we think painting should give us as an experience. And I don't know how you relate to that while making these things, because I don't make them. You kind of have to think about it more than I do.
I think I mean experiencing painting is probably one of my favorite types of experiences. But I'm a painter, so I don't necessarily like expect that from everybody, but it is one of those. I mean, my paintings really are about like the totality of the painting experience. They're not just an image, they're not just color, they're not just surface, they're like all of those things together. And they can be so minimal that for me, it makes every choice that much more kind of like deliberate and intense. So it's like if the color range is very small, it becomes very important, like how far you push that or which colors, like, yeah, this color is going to be a little bit more saturated. Like, any little movement that you put into the design can really either enhance it or wreck it. And they become more and more like nuanced, I mean, that's something I definitely have noticed over the past couple of years of painting. It's like working within these kind of like parameters, things have become very, very nuanced, and like little moves can become very big in the totality of the painting. I mean, that's like, again, that like it makes me think of Ryman, where it's like his parameters are so limited that it's like, oh yeah, if I'm doing these strokes here and I leave like a little bit of canvas showing through, it becomes like a very big part of the work, and I'm kind of working in that space too. This is kind of interesting. So like when I lived in New York, I worked for Jeff Koons for a long time, and a big chunk of the time I worked there, I was mixing color for his paintings. So it was like literally years and like 8-hour days of like, you're just mixing color. You're like matching swatches, like literally. And I liked it. It was very meditative. I could like listen to podcasts and stuff. It was a nice job actually. But like what I didn't expect was like, it basically like makes you this like color savant because you get this like Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 hours of like color matching. And now it's become very helpful and like useful in like making these paintings, because it's very easy for me to pick this sort of like limited range of greens, for example, and know all of like the different possibilities, whether it's like through saturation or temperature or whatever, that I can go, and also like the specific like pigments that will make different colors, and it's like that type of training, which I didn't think of as training at the time, it was just a job, has become part of my work. And when I look at it now, when I look at my paintings now, like I compare them to maybe 10, 15 years ago, they're much more subtle and much more nuanced in these ways. So that, yeah, it's like when you're working with so few things, everything becomes very important. Every like the size of something, where it is, the value structure, the color structure, all of those things become super important. And this was always like something I would tell my students too. It's like usually like painters or beginning painters, at least, like they're always putting more and more stuff in. Like, this isn't working. I gotta put more and more in. I gotta do more and more things. And usually it should be the opposite. It's like you want to get rid of things and like really start like limiting the things that you're doing until you get to something good. And you know, that's I'm kind of like coming at it from that angle when I'm painting. Yeah, the color's been kind of interesting because lately it's been I've been opening it up like to just sort of like pushing the saturation levels a little bit more, which has been kind of fun. But again, it's like it's probably such like minuscule amounts that like most people are like, "What are you talking about?"
Well, that makes me maybe something to end on that might be good. You know, I feel like a lot of what we've been like talking about always sort of goes back to like, you know, the transformative potential of like painting, of art, or like these experiences. You know, it seems like, you know, yeah, throughout the conversation, you know, we've been coming back to like these sort of moments of like having an experience where you realize that something could be different than it was, you know, whether that's sort of like with like experiencing the Picassos or even just experiencing like, you know, the landscapes in Chicago. And then also, you know, with your work itself and the way that viewers relate to it, you know, everything sort of seems to be about getting to this point of like understanding what is like the like minimum necessary like content or something or form, you know, necessary for somebody to have like this you know, experience of the painting as being something that can change, or that can, you know, that it is what it is, but it's also something else. You know, so I guess, yeah, how do you think about that that aspect of art?
I think it's I'm always like really fascinated as to like how different people experience painting in particular, and you know what they sort of get out of it. You know, I mean, I most of my friends are also painters, and you know, we talk in like this kind of like very specific kind of shorthand about the painting experience and the things that we get excited about. But then sometimes I'll talk to non-painters and I'll be talking the same way, and they're like, "What are you talking about?" You know, it's like, what, you know, it's like, why are you looking at the side of a canvas or whatever? And you know, a lot of times like people just see image, you know, and you know, I think about, for me, that's sort of like going back to the Picasso show, like when I saw it at the time, and again, this is before I was even painting, I was very struck by like the surfaces of those paintings. And it's something that like stuck out, you know, the painterliness. And I think that's probably because prior to that, I'd only seen most paintings in reproduction, and I hadn't really started to like put together like the materiality of paint, you know, and what that means. And I think like just in general, I've always been like a very sensitive and like sensual person in that way, of like tactile responses to things. And I think that's like a big part of what painting means to me, you know, the possibilities of that kind of surface and how I kind of interpret it. It's almost like food or something. It's like, you know, it's like smelling delicious food, or, you know, it's like a very weird response that I'm sure like a lot of people probably don't have. have it. It's very weird to describe, but it's like it's sort of one of the things that brings me back to doing this, like why it's so fun for me to do. It's not even, sometimes it really is just like, it's just like the moving around paint and like just like the experience of this material can be enough to like motivate me to make a painting. And I think like for me that's like that like real world kind of tactility is such an important part of making paintings and experiencing them. And it's been an interesting kind of like something like Instagram is very good at like turning you on to people you've never seen before. But then at the same time, it's like you don't have that experience. And like the best way to see this stuff always is in person, I mean, you can get really good at being able to interpret things from photographs, especially like really good high res photographs. But it really is like the best way to see these objects is always going to be in person. And that sort of aura that they have, at least over me, is just like so is so important as like an experience, like a thing that I kind of like live for and get excited about, anytime I go to the museums or galleries and I see something that I like that's the way I'm usually like responding to it, and that's the way it's kind of like it's acting as like a worthwhile aesthetic experience. I'm not very like, I can look at paintings and like think a lot about, I can think about them in a lot of different ways, whether that's like what I think the perceived content is of the painting, or how like a market would like look at the painting, or how I just interpret it just through its like surface and through form and color and all of those things. So there's all these different levels, but typically like the ones that stick with me and the ones that I want to always go back to, it's usually that like, it's that more sensuous, tactile experience. Like those are the ones that are the most mysterious, and those are the ones that I always come back to like wanting to experience again. And there's always painting that I see that, maybe the image is good, and it has like a decent, like interesting kind of content to it. But a lot of times like those are paintings that kind of like fade from my memory pretty quickly. And I don't necessarily need to see them again, or am excited to see them again. And it's usually the other types that I'm like, there's something here. I can't quite get what's here. I want to like try to figure it out. It's like hanging out with like an interesting person. It's like you just always want to have a conversation with them. It's like, oh, I can't wait to see this person that I really love. It's like they're always telling me something interesting that I hadn't thought of before, rather than hanging out with somebody that's just like lecturing you about the same thing like every time you see them. So I don't know, like that's like my relationship with them, and that's like the relationship that I try to have with my own work too. I think the most successful pieces that I make, or usually when I don't destroy something, is when I kind of don't know how I made the thing, or the thing is like, I can experience this thing that I made in a way as if I didn't make it, and it's usually like when I make something that that comes off as like too obvious that I like know how I did it, or that's like, those are the things that usually get painted over, which is kind of like it's kind of like a funny paradox, because you spend all this time like learning how to do this thing, and you're in your studio and you're trying to do it, and ultimately you're just trying to make something that you don't even know how you did it. And like, and it may as well have been made by someone else. It's like, you almost can't even like take credit for it. You're just like, yeah, it's like, this is this thing that I enjoy as much as you enjoy, because I don't even know where it came from, you know? And that's like a very, that's sort of what you're always like struggling towards and trying to do. And it's very difficult to do that. It's not something you do every day. And a lot of the rest of the time in the studio, you're just very frustrated that you can't just do that every day. But it's kind of like, I don't know, yeah, it's an interesting paradox as like an artist. It's like, you spend all this time like doing these things that you almost feel like you shouldn't even take credit for. Makes sense.
Yeah, that's great. That's great.
I think before it also made me think about how it would look back to you after a couple, like 10 years after you painted that thing. They will keep like telling you something that is just strange and different, which is
Yeah.
what I said about, you know, being able to reflect back upon the things that you've done. And well, thanks so much for doing this. This was fun.
Oh, thank you guys. This was really fun. Yeah, I really
That was
enjoyed
great.
it. Yeah.
Wait, one final question. That was great to end, but I'm gonna throw this there because you're a teacher this
Yes.
thing. And that is like a totally different level of things to do. Like, how do you approach teaching this? Like, how do you approach teaching art to students? What are they like? You said, is it college students or is it?
I've taught both. I taught college in New York for a few years, and then here I taught private school for 4 years. I mean, high school level, 9 through 12, and then I taught public school for I taught public school for 2 years during the pandemic, which was challenging to say the least. But yeah, teaching's not for everybody, obviously, but if you like it, I liked it. It can be very like rewarding, and it's kind of like, you know, as a teacher, it can kind of be like, I'm just as excited to like do the projects as they are, or like figure out like what to show them, and see what they do, you know. And in general, it's always nice to be in like an environment, a creative environment, where people are want to make things and like want to get like better at like what it is they're doing. And for me, that was really like the reward of teaching, getting to know all of these like creative young people that were you know, wanting to sort of like learn the same things that I wanted to learn when I was that age, you know. And you know, I really enjoyed it. It's fun. After the pandemic, I'm like taking a little bit of a teaching break, but yeah, it was interesting. The other thing is I was teaching here in Chicago. I was teaching a lot of ceramics too. So that was something I got really into because I was teaching it for many years, and that was just like another discipline. I don't really know that it really like influenced painting or anything, but it was like it was kind of like a nice thing, like creative thing to do outside of painting. That was that I didn't really have to. I mean, I really approached it like just like sort of functional ceramics, and it was kind of like just like these nice like sort of skills to practice. It's very like meditative, you know. But yeah, teaching is really fun. I like reverse engineering paintings and projects for students, you know, and just sort of like seeing something and sort of like reverse engineering it and then changing something about that and giving it to my students as like a project, you know. That was like one of my favorite things to do.
Okay, that's great. Thanks so much. was great talking to you, and we should keep in touch. And
For sure.
excited for the show in January. Like Patrick
Yes.
always forgets to talk about this thing, even though he's organized.
No, we'll start getting promoted soon, but yes, show in January at Make Room in Los Angeles. Yeah, end of January.
Yeah, it's super exciting. Really excited for it.
It's gonna be cool. Great. Thanks, Will. It's nice talking to you.
Nice talking to you guys. Thank you guys.
Thank
See you
you.
guys.
Bye.